we all know Keir Starmer's weak, and instead now it's kind of just exposed this great divide within the Labour Party, which is not going to go away. And I think it is going to come to the surface after those May elections. And if Labour does lose that by-election, which you'd have to think they may well do now, then there's only one person they can blame for it, and that'll be the Prime Minister.
Will blocking Andy Burnham solve Keir Starmer's problems? How can the Tories seize the centre ground? And the real reason Kemi Badenoch joined the Tory party, which may not be what you think. And joining me to unpack all of that, I've got the Times' Seb Payne. Hello, Seb.
Good morning, Hugo.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Not sad not to be in the studio with you, but just as blessed as always to be with you.
Don't spoil it. The listeners don't need to know that. I could say you're here and wearing and dressed like a panda. No one's going to know. And also Charlotte Ivers, who is here and dressed like a panda.
Hello, Hugo. I just realised I hadn't actually put my headphones on, so I couldn't hear Seb. I was kind of assuming that he would be here with us, and it was quite peaceful. I thought, this is just me getting to speak.
Just the spirit of him, drifting through the studio like a ghost. We've got a lot of politics to cover today. Let's crack on. The Prime Minister is facing a backlash from some Labour MPs after the party blocked the Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham's attempt to become an MP. Burnham had hoped to stand in the Gorton and Denton by-election. Labour's National Executive Committee isn't having it. The decision has certainly worsened Labour infighting, yet the Scotland Secretary, Douglas Alexander, told Times Radio that the intention was to prevent more political psychodrama.
Yesterday, the officers of the National Executive Committee had to weigh quite a difficult set of judgments, looking at the Labour Party rules, where there's a presumption against sitting mayors standing in a parliamentary by-election, whether it was right to cause what would be an otherwise unnecessary mayoral contest equivalent to 20 parliamentary by-elections or more in Manchester, and the risk that that contest would absorb time, energy and money. My sense is the Prime Minister may speak on this himself today, but the judgment was more about focus than factionalism.
Charlotte, do you think Starmer is permanently damaged by this?
Yes, probably. I think he's probably done the right thing in terms of protecting his own future, but I think that has come with a cost, which is that he looks weak and he looks like he is scared of Andy Burnham, and he probably should be. I think it's worth noting as well that suppose Andy Burnham had been given this opportunity to participate in this by-election, you've then got people like, for example, just pull a name out of thin air, Wes Streeting, who would also, we think, quite like to have a crack at the top job. He sort of has to look at that then and go, I better move now. I better move before Burnham's even got the chance to compete against me. So I think this could have been, had Starmer not stopped Andy Burnham from doing this, this could have been the end of him within a week or two, frankly.
Seb, always so much hype around Andy Burnham. If he ever does become Prime Minister, he better be pretty damn good.
The thing about Andy Burnham is people love the idea of Andy Burnham until he actually has to do it. He's been the perennial prince across the water for about 15 years now in Labour Party politics. And we should remember he did run for the Labour leadership twice, and they were both spectacularly bad leadership contests. And in 2015, when he entered as the favourite, the obvious person to win, he was beaten by grumpy old Jeremy Corbyn. So, people get very enthusiastic about him, but it never sort of quite goes to plan. But I think to your question you just posed to Charlotte, it's less that this damages Keir Starmer than I think it's exposed how weak and fragile his position is. Because the fact is, if he hadn't blocked Andy Burnham, yes, he would have almost certainly got selected and probably won the by-election. And then when it comes to May's local elections, there would have been a very obvious alternative for Prime Minister sitting in the House of Commons. Now there is the other alternative, as Charlotte said, which is Wes Streeting. But the fact is, Keir Starmer, what else could he do? If he tried to do let Andy Burnham come to Westminster, let's see how, team of rivals, lots of tall poppies, then that wouldn't have worked, because we all know Keir Starmer's weak. And instead now it's kind of just exposed this great divide within the Labour Party, which is not going to go away. And I think it is going to come to the surface after those May elections. And if Labour does lose that by-election, which you'd have to think they may well do now, then there's only one person they can blame for it, and that'll be the Prime Minister.
Well, if you look at the various ways this could have panned out, if Burnham had stood for this seat, he would have had to have stood down as the man with hard done by and not have to do anything about it.
Yes, absolutely. And as you just heard from Seb there, everyone loves Andy Burnham until they're actually asked to vote for Andy Burnham. And so I think this is kind of, I've sort of got some sort of Schrodinger's cat thing going around my head. Andy Burnham forever can be neither dead nor alive. He is neither a bad Prime Minister or, you know where I'm aiming with all of this. And I think that's absolutely fantastic for him. Yes, it's so odd, this. I find the idea idea that because Andy Burnham is doing a fairly decent job of running Manchester, that he is in some way equipped to run the country, just absolutely insane. I don't think anything about what he does has proved that he is this kind of miraculous talent who would be able to turn around the Whitehall machine in a way that no one else has managed.
Well, he's been speaking at a think tank event this morning. He sounds a bit sad.
I've said everything I think I'm going to say about that today. I'm very much focusing on my job.
Well, Zach Polanski said the Greens aren't even going to run for the seat. This does sound a bit like it could be a reform slam dunk.
It does at the moment, and it's going to be interesting to see who they stand there. There was some speculation over the weekend that Zia Youssef could stand there, since he's the most senior reform figure who is not currently an MP. And given, as you said, the party's national polling plus this internecine Labour warfare, Reform will have a pretty good chance of taking it on. The question for Labour is who they do stand. And there was a lot of speculation that Bev Craig, who is the leader of Manchester City Council and is a councillor in that seat, would stand. Michael Crick, who follows the ups and downs of people trying to become MPs, as I've experienced myself, he said that Bev Craig is not going to stand there. So it might not necessarily be a big Labour figure. They put probably a kind of hardcore local campaigner. There's all speculation this could happen pretty quickly because they always want to get this out the way and done as soon as possible. So if they move the writ now, we could have the by-election towards the end of February, which means it's before May, before the locals, because if it all happens then, if it's all kind of a big hit towards Keir Starmer, it will be worse off, I think, than having two separate hits against the Prime Minister's authority.
Well, what fun. Speaking of reform, Nigel Farage says the US is no longer backing Keir Starmer's Chagos Islands deal after he got the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to take a second look at it at Davos. The government has pulled the bill on the island's future from the House of Lords while it tries to work out what to do next. Seb, Farage says the US is now horrified by the Chagos Islands deal. Are they really? It was basically the US who told us to do it. Is this just Farage grandstanding and getting a bit of support, or do you think the United States is genuinely concerned by this?
I think there's a much bigger issue. The United States generally doesn't care about this. And I think it was quite a low-order issue that we've obviously are very exercised about the Chagos farrago here, and it's had a lot of backwards and forwards between Labour and the Conservatives. But I think in America, when Donald Trump's sort of trying to topple several regimes at once at the moment, it's just not really registered. And when the deal was originally done, it just sort of was signed across, and Donald Trump said it was a good idea because he was told to. But for some reason now, it's now got up the agenda of the Trump administration. And Scott Bessent, who's the Treasury Secretary, has come out and said that this is a very bad thing, as said per Nigel Farage. It's kind of just part of a wider thing, though, of Donald Trump turning against Keir Starmer, that Donald Trump, it is court politics. You're either in or you're out, and he likes you or he doesn't. There's no kind of in-between of that. And he liked Keir Starmer until he sent one military attaché to Greenland for whatever reason. And at that point, Keir Starmer is now the root of all evil, as far as Donald Trump seems to think, which means the Chagos is a bad deal. Keir Starmer is a bad Prime Minister, and no doubt there'll be much more backwards and forwards over that. But the core of it is, if the whole US diplomatic machine, that is the State Department and the Pentagon, decide they don't want to do the Chagos deal, then the Chagos deal isn't going to happen. What we don't know is this just freelancing by random people in the Trump administration, or is this a genuine policy turn? If it's the latter, then that's a very big deal and a big problem for Keir Starmer. But I think there's a chance it could just be the former.
Charlotte, you've been writing about Chagos in the Sunday Times for many Chagosians who've ended up in Port Louis.
I have. I spent last week in Mauritius, where I got sent at about 2 hours' notice, and it's an 11-hour flight away. And
Wow.
it turns out if you complain to people that you've been sent to Mauritius for work, no one has any sympathy. Because they just think you're lying on some beautiful beach somewhere.
Yeah, I don't care about your problems.
No, but let me tell you now, Port Louis, the capital of Mauritius, is not particularly pleasant, because obviously if you are someone who has money, wants a nice life in Mauritius, you will live in a nice beach house somewhere and commute in. So the actual city itself is sparse, I would say, and quite weird. After 5 p.m, there's just no one on the streets. It's quite unnerving in a way. But the Chagosians, I mean, I think we sort of forget the thing at the core of this when the Chagosians were removed from their islands forcibly by the British in the 1970s, so, within the lifetimes of most people listening to this, they were basically sitting on these kind of paradise islands. Someone would catch a fish and they would all eat the fish that evening for dinner. And they kind of lived in this sort of weird agrarian kind of communal society. And then one day they were just shoved onto boats. Their dogs were shot. They were only allowed to take one suitcase with them. And they were put in the middle of a modern 1970s city. Like, just imagine that. What an astonishing and traumatizing and debilitating thing. Loads of them couldn't read and write. None of them had any sort of skills. None of them had ever sort of had to have a job in the way you and I would consider a job before. And they really, really struggled. And a lot of their descendants today are still really, really struggling. They've got a huge problem with drugs in their community. A lot of them live in these horrible slums on the outskirts of Port Louis. Even the ones that have done better for themselves, they are not thriving. They have expensive healthcare bills because these people, they tend to be in their sort of late 60s, 70s now. So they're getting to the point where they need healthcare. Their lives are going to be challenging over the next decade or so, and they just don't have any resources. And we basically gave them nothing when we first did this. A couple of years in, we sort of went, oh, sorry, and gave them a couple of grand each. But now you think the amount of money it's going to take to fix this community's problems is so huge. Whereas if you've just given them all 100 grand on day one, they'd probably be all right now.
Or indeed relocated them to a nicer island, perhaps. What are they?
Or not sort of march them off, yeah.
Given they're very unlikely to get their island back because it's got, various military bases on it, what do they want to happen?
Well, they also don't want well, it's not that they don't want their island back. They like the idea of it belonging to them, but none of them are going to move there because none of them have any infrastructure. These are kind of empty, kind of barren wastelands now. What they want is some sort of financial support from the British government. So some of them talked about a pension, some of them talk about reparations. I think really what they would quite like is what's already happening, which is they are getting £40 million as part of this Mauritius Chagos deal. So in theory, you could do a lot of kind of social engineering with that, right? You could provide healthcare, you could do job opportunities. The problem is, in 2016, in theory, the British government pledged another £40 million to them, and none of them have seen it. They said, oh, yeah, the British Council do some English lessons. They had, this made me quite depressed, they had like little boat trips where you could go on a boat and see the place that you were dragged away from as a 4-year-old. Great. But nothing to kind of properly help them. And it's basically the Foreign Office being rubbish and failing to get the money out of the door and, prevaricating too much. So what they want is for that 40 million to actually be spent and to be spent in the way that they feel benefits them rather than sort of given to the Mauritian government and never actually see the light of day.
It's a harrowing story, essential reading in the paper. Seb, when people debate the Chagos Islands today, when you hear it debated in the Commons and so on, when Donald Trump talks about it, no one's really talking about the Chagosians. I know Kemi Badenoch mentioned them at PMQs, but it always feels a bit expedient, a sort of expedient way of making a different political argument. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, completely, Hugo. And I think one of the few MPs who's been focused on this is the former and current MPs for Crawley in Surrey, which I believe is where a lot of the Chagosians who were removed from their islands actually moved to. So you have Henry Smith was the Conservative MP who used to speak a lot about them as well. And I think bizarrely, so did Andrew Rosendale, who's defected to Reform over the Chagos deal, even though he did previously want to have some kind of deal or reparations given for the Chagosians. You're right that the kind of the argument happens in Westminster is all about the Diego Garcia Air Force Base in the UK national interest, but very little about the people who we upended, half a century ago. So it is very depressing, the whole thing, and also it is just a political football now, whereas Reform and the Conservatives find it as a good way of kicking Labour over this as well. But I think ultimately the whole thing is just a very tawdry episode, I think, in our history, and I don't think where it's ended is particularly good either.
Seb, you've been writing as well in the Times about Nigel Farage and how he was right on his old by-election principles, if less so his new ones. You basically say that MPs should face by-elections when they flip parties. Explain that to us.
So if you had the ghost of Edmund Burke on your radio programme, Hugo, which I know would be something you would love, then he would be talking about MPs being the representatives, not delegates of their constituents, and that, party branding is just something that you kind of take the whip and follow their line on. But I don't actually think that is the case anymore. And I argued in the paper last week that there should be some form to have a by-election when an MP does change parties for a couple of reasons. First of all, party names have been on ballot papers since 1970. It was introduced in 1968. Before that, it would just say their profession, actually. So it would say Hugo Rifkind, broadcaster, for example, without any reference to what party you were. But ever since then, when people vote for a candidate, they are kind of voting for a party as well. And the British Election Study have done quite a lot of work into this, and they rank it as people voting for the leader of the party, and then the candidate. So if you're what these Conservative MPs have gone over to Reform, it's quite hard to say everyone was voting for me personally, as Robert Jenrick was kind of arguing last week. So I think there should be some recall mechanism if people are unhappy about it. And what I suggested is that if MPs break parliamentary rules, you can have a recall petition where 10% of their electorate voted and it causes a by-election, which of course they're very welcome to stand in. So I think there should be some kind of mechanism that if you do change party affiliation from the one you elected on, you can have a recall petition. If people feel strongly enough, then you could have a by-election. And what is so bizarre about this is Nigel Farage was absolutely fuming in the past when people defected parties. The example I used in the column was Christian Wakeford when he went from Labour to the Conservatives in 2022, and Mr. Farage went on his GB News show and fulminated for a full 2.5 minutes at how disgusting and awful and disrespectful this all was. And now it's when it's happening his way, he doesn't seem to really care anymore. So, so much for them principles.
Charlotte, what do you think? I mean, obviously, if MPs had to face a by-election, or even were likely to face a by-election when they defected to different parties, they wouldn't do that. It would be inhibiting.
It would be inhibiting. I completely agree with Seb. I think anytime you see any sort of data on the extent to which an individual MP can move the dial when their party is up and down, it's basically non-existent. There is no such thing really as a personal vote. And so the idea that they should be able to kind of bounce around and represent whoever they want to, I think is completely mad. It was quite interesting listening to Danny Kruger, the Tory MP who went to Reform the other day. I think he was being interviewed by Stig or someone, and who was saying, well, why don't you call a by-election? He said, well, if I'm just moving between opposition parties, if I was moving from government to opposition or vice versa, then that would be different. I thought, what?
Yeah, that's
okay. You can see him sort of sitting at home and being like, I've got it.
That's a convenient new rule to invent, isn't it? Yeah. Look, on the subject of the Chagosians, thanks to everyone who's getting in touch to point out that Crawley is in Sussex, not in Surrey. Indeed it is. I'm sure Seb merely misspoke.
I did. Apologies.
Getting his Ss mixed up. Look, let's talk about the Tories for a moment, because, of course, with Labour being in turmoil, how do the Conservatives capitalise on that? They're being urged by the former Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson, formerly of this parish as well, of course, and the former West Midlands Mayor Sir Andy Street, to seize the centre ground to win the support of about 7 million politically homeless voters. Charlotte, is this a good idea? I get the idea. Obviously, there are former centrist Tories who might feel a bit politically homeless, but there's other stuff going on as well. What do you think?
I think probably that is the Conservatives' best hope. I suppose there are two theories, aren't there? There are either out-reform or create a sort of middle ground that has been abandoned by Reform and hope that you can differentiate yourself sufficiently from the Labour Party. And I think that is possible because Keir Starmer is sort of in that middle ground as well. But then so was Tony Blair way back when. And David Cameron managed to compete with Tony Blair by also tracking towards the centre and being Mr. Fiscal Responsibility, but being a little bit to the right of Blair. So I think that ground is available. I think given there are a lot of people, mainly sort of highly educated professionals kicking around the country who are just never going to vote Reform, but who are being taxed quite heavily. I think there's a lot of people out there who would, in theory, go for a Conservative Party that sort of looks a bit David Cameron-y right now.
Well, I mean, they might, but it's not necessarily the one they've got, is the thing. I mean, Seb, speaking to Stig this morning, I think it was Matt Vickers, the MP, he was incredibly reluctant to describe the Conservatives as even potentially being the party of the centre. He kept saying, we are a party of the right. He wouldn't say it. And I mean, there's a lot of Tories who are just appalled at the idea of going for the centre.
Well, let me be incredibly tedious for a moment and take issue with this whole concept of the idea of what is the centre ground, because this thing is the idea that you've got equidistant between the left and right wing of politics, wherever that is. I just don't think it's a helpful term at all, because it's about triangulating off kind of the excesses of the left and the excesses of the right to try and get to a place that kind of speaks to most people in the country. A much more kind of better way of looking at it is what Keith Joseph, Margaret Thatcher's close aide, called the common ground of politics, which is looking at where the values of the kind of the mass middle of the country are, as opposed to looking at left and right. And the issue I have with this new group is, although it's got some obviously very great people in like Ruth Davidson, Andy Street, they feel like they're slightly in a past age, the kind of politics they're talking about. Because if you look at public opinion when it comes on immigration or on border controls or on net zero, these guys are nowhere near where that is. They're trying to go back to a kind of pre-Brexit era and pretend that 2016 to 2019 just didn't happen to the right in this politics, which it did. And the fact is the Conservative Party is the party of Brexit, whether it likes it or not. And these are people who kind of fell out of the party in that basis. And I don't really know what this group is trying to do here. If they want to make the case for that kind of politics, that's fine. But Kemi Badenoch is certainly not going to listen to it. I think there's very few people in the shadow cabinet who are going to listen to it, not just because it's not their politics, but just because I don't think it's electorally viable. That the people who left the Conservative Party over Brexit and over kind of going a bit more rightwards, they've done so because it follows public opinion, but also because you can't recreate that coalition. You've got to look at a different kind of voting coalition in the post-Brexit world. So it just feel as if it's kind of a bit like yesterday's men in when you look at the people who are saying the same arguments of the past that just don't really fit this particular moment. And I'm sure the shadow cabinet is not particularly grateful to having this intervention, because when Robert Jeremy left, Kemi's been desperate to say, no, the Conservatives are still a very right-wing party. I am still very right-wing. But then you've got all these people who've come out the woodwork saying, actually, no, we could be much more centrist as opposed to right-wing. And I think Kemi will be pushing back quite hard against that.
Well, speaking of Kemi Badenoch, she was on Desert Island Discs this weekend and she confessed that she joined the Tories in the first place for the parties. Charlotte, was that a smart move? Is there no party, like a young Conservative party?
I think what Kemi Badenoch is saying there actually kind of gets something at the core of political parties, which is for a lot of people involved in them, they are a social club. They're almost a social crutch in some cases. And I think the thing people always say is if you're a member of a political party, you're weird, right? Like a vanishingly small percentage of the population is. But for people who that is their interest, it's a bit like kind of, I don't know, being super into badminton. You end up hanging out with people who are like you and also love badminton and you have a lovely time. I've always had this theory, which this is just quite a mean thing to say, but I've started now. This theory about Liz Truss. That her politics sort of came from, so obviously, you know, she was very kind of libertarian. There's a think tank called the Adam Smith Institute. And I remember when I was first sort of hanging around Westminster, they would always have drinks parties and they would invite Liz Truss, who was sort of an incredibly unpopular and unfashionable cabinet minister at that point. But she would arrive at these libertarian drinks parties and everyone would be like, wow, Liz Truss, you're so cool, you're so cool. And I sort of think she kind of just like,
she was groomed.
She's just sort of felt happy, you know. Wow. And if everyone of a certain persuasion is telling you, oh, Hugo, you're so wonderful, then you start to go, ooh, these are nice people. These are kind of sound people. These are my people. And I think the way that social links work within Westminster is so interesting, and it does shape people's politics so much. It's hard to explain to people who've never worked there how unlike a normal workplace is. It's much more like being at a kind of university campus, really, than it is at working at, say, KPMG or something. You're so sort of in each other's lives all the time, and you know, it is a bit odd, and I think it does change people and shape people politically.
Seb, I want you to, look, you're among friends here. I want you to forget you're being recorded and forget you're being broadcast and tell us what the wildest thing you ever got up to at a young Conservative evening with Kemi Badenoch was.
Oh, Hugo, what an image. To be very clear, I was never a member of the Young Conservatives and did not come across Kemi Badenoch then, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to...
You're breaking my heart.
I know I'm disappointing you, Greg. I don't really know what I'm here for, not offering this kind of anecdote. I think, unfortunately, I have to agree with Charlotte here that I think people who join political parties for the social element, it tends to be a little bit odd. When I think back to the Young Conservatives when I was at Durham University, they were, shall we say, not necessarily the sort of people I would actively seek out. I think it's fair
they wouldn't necessarily have other social options, I think is a good way to describe that.
That is a very polite way of describing Hugo. But I think ultimately with political parties, I mean, either you join it because you want to get involved in politics. And I think, you know, Kemi probably did. And I think in the Lord Ashcroft biography of Kemi Badenoch that came out, I think, last year or so, it basically said that when she'd been to university and was growing up in the returned to the UK, having grown up abroad, the Conservative Party provided a kind of structure and something that was kind of very deep into English and British culture that she kind of joined, and it gave her a sort of structure around having not grown up here. So I think I can see where that is coming from. But I think, yeah, parties, I mean, just no, basically, just is all I'm going to say, and just leave it at that.
She also said on Desert Island Discs, and by the way, later on in this show, we're going to be looking at her music choices specifically, but she also said her luxury item was going to be the 22 movies of the Marvel Cinematic Universe Infinity Saga. I know I only barely know what that means, but I still find it awful. Charlotte?
Good for her. Good for her.
Really? Good for her?
What I quite like.
Really? Are you sure?
Well, it is the
if
sort
Liv
of...
Truss has said that, you'd think she was bonkers.
Kemi Badenoch really likes comic books, and she likes kind of like manga and cartoons and stuff like that. I interviewed her last year, and I said something. I said to her something like, people say you like watching cartoons, Kemi, and she went, yeah, like cartoons for adults, not children's cartoons. I was like, okay, gosh, she was horrified by the idea that, I thought she might be watching Bluey or something like that. But she likes what she likes, and I respect that about Kemi Badenoch. I think what we are seeing increasingly is her become a bit more comfortable of just like being who she is and sort of saying, well, look, do you like this? I don't really care either way. Here's who I am. You mentioned on the radio earlier about the songs that she chose, and she picked 2 songs from Hamilton, and which is just a bit mental, really. And usually you'd look at a politician's Desert Island Discs and you go, God, that's been focus grouped within an inch of its life. So It's quite good when you just go, that's chaos. What's going on here? This is really weird, because it means she's just telling you what's going on in her weird little brain. I love it.
Seb, would you like to spend the rest of eternity on a desert island watching the Marvel Cinematic Universe Infinity Saga with Kemi Badenoch?
I think I can think of other things to spend the rest of Infinity with that would not involve some of those elements that you've just said there. What I will say is, bringing those films to the island, if you've not got a DVD player or a laptop, that does quite an issue if you just have a box set sitting there that you can't actually do anything with. So you need a couple of more luxuries. But I will say, I do remember being told a tale of someone who was on Desert Island Discs, I'm not going to say who it is, who focus grouped every single song that they did at a cost of several £million. And the top song they came out with for their first Desert Island disc was Shape of You by Ed Sheeran. So that is such a great use of time. So I say, on fair play to Kemi for just doing what she clearly just thinks, and did not obviously engage some kind of mad focus group polling world to try and figure out what was the best thing to come across.
As I said, we'll be talking about that later, but she picks 8 songs and it does make it sound like she's heard 8 songs. Look, let's talk briefly about China. Starmer, he's going to see the growing Labour psychodrama we've been talking about as a major distraction from many problems Britain faces on the world stage, with China being a big one of them. He's about to become the first Prime Minister in nearly a decade to travel to Beijing to meet President Xi. Is he going to be enjoying himself, Seb? Because on the one level, he always likes to be on the world stage. He always looks good on the world stage. It's always a nice escape from home. But then China?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of covered some of this in the editorial in today's Times. The fact it's quite an odd trip, this, because it's clearly linked to the embassy decision that this visit to China has been on and off for a while. And then suddenly the new Chinese embassy at the former Royal Mint in East London has been approved. And then suddenly Keir Starmer's off to China. What a coincidence. And it's one of these trips where they'll go, they'll announce lots of economic partnerships. There'll be a big, nice, fat number, and everyone will say, isn't this great? But the real question is, where does this leave, where does this leave the kind of more contentious issues of UK-Chinese relations? So Jimmy Lai, for example, the newspaper publisher, someone that the UK has been campaigning to be released for a long time, who was arrested under security laws in Hong Kong. Does that come up? Does China's surveillance and activities on university campuses in the UK come up? Does the Westminster spying scandal, which kind of all collapsed earlier last year, does that come up? Or is this just Keir Starmer desperate to go there to get some economic good news, get a big fat number, then nothing after it really much happens? That feels much more likely to me. So is he having a good time? I mean, because it's on the world stage and not actually in Westminster, then yes, he's automatically having a better time than he is when he's trying to be Prime Minister. But I just don't think this trip is actually going to yield that much, because it's such an unequal, unbalanced relationship. And we're never going to raise the really difficult issues. And, he just wants to say, here's some economic good news.
Charlotte, China. Sum up China.
Well, Hugo, China is a land of contrast. I think what Keir Starmer is having to do here is really, really tricky. And the way that different successive governments over the last 20 years or so have treated China has flip-flopped and kind of swung around fairly wildly. There's sort of a normalization period and then a big swing against it. And it does fundamentally come down to what Seb was saying there, which is that we can get some economic good news from China. It's just really big. Any sort of trade deal we do with them is going to bring in quite a lot of money. The problem is that we just don't have the authority. We could march in and tell Xi Jinping any number of things about civil liberties, about the Uyghurs, about who knows. And what are we going to do about it? We're this little tiny island. And yeah, I think there's a reason why it's so easy for British politicians to do foreign policy. It's because the things they say and the choices they make don't really matter that much. It's so quite hard for things to go badly wrong.
Yeah, indeed. Look, finally, before I let you guys go, the Uber, the ride-sharing app, says that people in Edinburgh made the most journeys using their app between 10 at night and 4 in the morning, and they say this data shows Edinburgh is the best UK city for nightlife. Either of you have any views on that? Because I have some.
So do I, which is that presumably means that Edinburgh is quite a good city for UK nightlife, but doesn't have very good public transport. Because why would you be getting an Uber if you could get a tram or a bus home?
Boom! There you go. Glasgow has effectively an underground network.
Yeah.
Edinburgh has pubs that stay open later than pubs do down south. So, of course, people are up later.
That is true, but that does actually mean that their nightlife is marginally better, I suppose.
Just doesn't mean it's better, it just means it's later.
Yeah, that is true. I think Manchester obviously has really good public transport. I think that is the best nightlife city in the UK. I think it's, when you walk through the centre of Manchester on a Friday night, it's like everyone is going to the same party. It's fantastic. I think part of that is just the sheer number of students. That's always going to make a city fun. But also, the rents are reasonably cheap. Yep. People are innovating when it comes to bars and restaurants. Great place.
Well, I would say Edinburgh nightlife is great as well, but the last time I really went out there was probably about 1998. Thanks very much indeed, Seb Payne. Thank you very much indeed, Charlotte Ivers. Great pleasure to have both of you here. This is Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio.